They sent 9,900 ships to invade Earth. Only 17 returned. The first thing I heard was the alarm. Not a test, not a drill. The real one. The kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain has even caught up. I was already pulling on my boots when the floor shook. I am Sergeant Yusra Okafor of the UN Earth Defense Corps, stationed at the coastal railgun platform outside Lagos, Nigeria. That morning, the sky above me turned from blue to black in less than 4 minutes. Not because of clouds. Because of ships, thousands of them. So many that the sunlight disappeared in stages. Like someone was slowly closing a curtain across the whole world. I had read the briefings. I had trained for this. I had spent 11 months preparing for this exact moment. But nothing prepares you for the moment you actually look up and count. And stop counting, because the number is too large to hold in your head. The Valkyrie had arrived. 8 months earlier, their first signal reached Earth. It was not a greeting. It was a list of terms. Join the Dominion willingly or be absorbed by force. Those were the only 2 options they offered. The message was broadcast in 47 languages simultaneously, which told us they had been watching us for a long time before they decided to speak. The translation was perfect. The arrogance behind every word was even more perfect. The Valkyrie Dominion had, at that point, absorbed 214 species. Not conquered, absorbed. The distinction mattered to them. They did not see themselves as invaders. They saw themselves as administrators arriving to bring order to a chaotic address. The largest prior resistance, from a species called the Rothari who had interstellar travel of their own, had lasted 4 days. 4 days. That was the record. The Valkyrie had included this information in their message to us. I think they meant it as a comfort. Earth's unified government, assembled in emergency session within 48 hours of the signal, gave their response 6 days later. It was a single sentence: we decline. I was in the barracks rec room when the response was broadcast. 40 soldiers, all of us watching the screen. When the words appeared, nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. We just looked at each other, because every one of us knew what came next, and every one of us had already quietly decided that we were going to be part of whatever that looked like. What came next was 3 months. The Valkyrie, in a gesture they probably considered generous, gave Earth 90 days to arrange its affairs. They had done this with other species. It was meant to allow for an orderly surrender process. It allowed for peaceful handover of infrastructure. It gave the conquered species time to say goodbye to whatever they had been before they became a footnote in Dominion records. Humanity used those 90 days differently. I want to be honest about what I saw in those 3 months, because I think people sometimes tell this story like it was clean and organized and heroic from the very beginning. It was not. It was loud and messy and terrifying. Factories that had been making consumer electronics were converted to produce components for railgun systems in under 2 weeks. Engineers worked shifts that should not be physically possible. I personally watched a 63-year-old retired propulsion specialist, George Adair, who had not worked in aerospace for 12 years, walk back into an active design room and within 4 hours produce a modification to our interceptor drone guidance systems that cut reaction lag by 30%. He just walked in, looked at the schematics and said, "This is wrong here, here, and here." And he was right. High school students were welding drone frames in converted gymnasiums. Marine biologists were calculating optimal placements for underwater acoustic arrays. Mathematicians who had spent their careers studying abstract theory were suddenly the most important people in rooms full of military planners. I saw a 22-year-old competitive gamer from Manchester named Oliver Rowe recruited directly into drone swarm coordination after his simulation scores came back. He was given a rank, a uniform, and 6 days of orientation. On day 7 he was running live combat models. None of this was orderly, but it was fast, and it was unified in a way that I genuinely did not believe humans were capable of before I watched it happen. Borders that had defined conflicts for centuries became irrelevant overnight. I served alongside soldiers from 14 different countries in my unit alone. Our supply chain included components manufactured on 5 different continents. Our command structure was a hybrid built from pieces of systems that had previously been rivals. None of that mattered. The Valkyrie had done something that thousands of years of diplomacy had never managed to do. They had given every human on Earth the same problem. By the time the 90 days ended, Earth was not the same planet they had sent that message to. My post was the Lagos coastal platform, one of over 400 railgun installations built or upgraded in those 3 months. Ours was partially buried under the shoreline, camouflaged under layers of sand and sensor-absorbing material, developed by a team out of Cape Town, who had originally been working on noise Reduction technology for shipping vessels. The Valkyrie's initial orbital scans would not detect it. That was the idea. On the day they arrived, I had been awake for 31 hours. I was not unusual in that. We had received word 4 hours before their fleet dropped into visible range that the approach vectors were confirmed. Every platform, every bunker, every tunnel network, every installation we had spent 3 months building quietly came to full readiness. I climbed to the observation position above the main battery housing and looked up. The ships entered atmosphere in formation. It was a perfect formation. That is the detail I keep coming back to when I think about that moment. 9,900 vessels, and they moved like a single organism, like a flock of birds so large it blocked the sky. They came in low enough that you could see hull details, could see to the angular lines of Valkyrie design, all sharp edges and dark materials that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. They were enormous. Each one was larger than anything we had built, and they came in slowly, deliberately. They were not in a hurry. Why would they be? In their experience, this part was already over. The resistance had been logged, the planet had been given its time, and now the administrators had arrived to complete the paperwork. Their commander broadcast his message at exactly the moment the fleet reached its designated altitude. His voice came through every communication channel simultaneously, the translation smooth and cold. He said, "Lay down all weapons. Your continued resistance will result in the extinction of your species. This is not a negotiation." My unit commander, a quiet woman named Captain Daisy Foley, was standing 2 meters away from me when the message came through. She listened to the whole thing. Then she looked at her watch, looked back up at the fleet, and said very calmly, 18 more minutes. I checked my own watch. I looked out at the empty city behind our position. Lagos, one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, had been evacuated over the previous 6 days. The streets were completely empty. The market that was usually visible from my observation post, always loud, always bright, was quiet and dark. Every major city on Earth had been evacuated, not in panic, in sequence, underground networks, mountain shelters, deep bunkers built into places the Valkyrie's initial scans would read as geological formations rather than inhabited structures. We had moved hundreds of millions of people underground in 6 days, and we had done it quietly enough that the incoming fleet's final approach scans showed them populated cities, signatures maintained by automated systems, movement patterns simulated by distributed machines, ghost cities, full of the right kind of noise to fool a sensor array that had never needed to be fooled before. The Valkyrie's landing parties descended in the first wave. 48,000 troops across 16 cities simultaneously, by our count. They came down in heavy landers, ramps dropping onto empty streets, soldiers moving in their perfect formations into what they expected to be crowds of frightened civilians waiting for direction. They found nothing. 18 minutes after their commander's broadcast, as the last of the landing craft touched down in the 6th wave of deployments, Captain Foley pressed a single button on her command panel. From underground, from beneath harbor floors, from the hillsides north of the city, from positions that had been hidden for 90 days, every electromagnetic pulse corridor in Lagos activated at once. Every piece of Valkyrie equipment within those city limits that depended on their networked communication system went dark in the same second. Across 16 cities simultaneously, 48,000 Valkyrie soldiers found themselves standing in a strange quiet darkness, cut off from every system they had ever relied on, in a world that had been specifically and carefully rebuilt to be very bad for them. Captain Foley looked at her watch again. She looked at me. Something in her expression was not exactly a smile. It was more settled than that, more certain. "They think they came here to finish something," she said. "They have no idea they just started it." Below us, in the hidden battery housing, our railgun crew was already running final alignment checks on targets in low orbit. We had a list. We had been building that list for 89 days. Above us, 9,900 ships held their altitude, waiting for the orderly process to complete, waiting for the reports from their ground teams to confirm what had always been confirmed before, waiting for the easy part. They were still waiting when the first shot fired. The shot that fired from the Lagos platform was not the first one to reach a target. That distinction went to a platform buried under a wheat field outside Adelaide, Australia, operated by a 6-person team led by a corporal named Dennis Hartwell, who had been a mechanical engineer in the mining industry before the war. Their targeting system acquired a Valkyrie destroyer at orbital altitude and sent a tungsten rod through its engine housing before the Lagos platform had finished its first rotation cycle. Dennis Hartwell's team then reloaded in 41 seconds, acquired a second target, and fired again. This was happening in 412 locations around the planet at the same time. I want to explain what the Valkyrie expected. Since understanding their expectation is the only way to understand why the next 14 months went the way they did. They had arrived with a fleet of 9,900 ships and nearly 4 million ground troops. By any measurement that had ever mattered in 214 previous campaigns, this was not a close contest. Their models, built from historical conquest data, predicted a ground resistance duration of between 6 and 72 hours. Their orbital dominance was assumed to be absolute. Their only logistical concern, noted in their own planning documents which we would later read, was ensuring that essential infrastructure was not too heavily damaged during the pacification process, because infrastructure was easier to inherit than to rebuild. They had not modeled for an enemy that spent 90 days building the battlefield. The first hours were chaos, but it was our chaos, which is a very different thing from the chaos they had brought to other worlds. Their landing parties in the evacuated cities found themselves in a trap that had been assembled piece by piece over 3 months. Every major urban center on Earth had been wired before evacuation. Electromagnetic pulse corridors ran through the streets and beneath foundations. Without their network connection, Valkyrie armor was powerful but slow. Without their communication relay, their formations could not coordinate. They were still dangerous. They were still armed. But they were isolated, and the cities they stood in had been designed by the people fighting them, modified in 90 days to be as unfavorable for Valkyrie infantry doctrine as our engineers could make them. My unit was part of the second wave response. We came in from the coastal positions after the first pulse corridors activated, moving through tunnel routes that had been cut beneath the city during the previous status. We surfaced in 3 different locations simultaneously, coordinated through a hardened fiber optic command network that had no wireless component for the Valkyrie to jam. The first Valkyrie soldier I ever saw in person was standing in the middle of a street 4 blocks from where I surfaced, holding a weapon it could not fire because the targeting system had gone dark. It was approximately 2 meters and 30 centimeters tall. Its armor was heavy and angular, designed for the kind of open field engagements that had worked against every prior species. Its head moved slowly, searching for a signal that was not coming. I had trained for this. We had all trained for this. And still, for about 3 seconds, I just stood at the end of that street and looked at something from another world, standing in a city I had grown up near, confused and cut off from everything it had relied on, and I thought, we did that. We made it confused. We built the thing that made it confused. 3 months ago, this creature and every creature like it thought this was going to be simple. Then the 3 seconds were up, and we did our jobs. The tunnel and ambush doctrine worked. It was not elegant and it was not clean, but it worked. We knew these streets. We knew which buildings had been reinforced and which had been deliberately left weak. We knew where the subsurface voids were, the ones the engineering teams had carved out beneath key intersections during the evacuation weeks, designed to give way under concentrated, heavy weight. The first Valkyrie Walker unit that moved into the northern residential district found 3 of those intersections in sequence. The ground gave way each time. 80-ton machines dropped into prepared excavations, and the machines behind them had to stop and navigate around them, funneling into corridors where our teams were waiting. 2 members of my unit did not come back from that first day. Private Louis Ossie and Corporal Faye Drummond. I knew them both. Louis had a younger brother in Accra who sent him food packages every 3 weeks. Faye had been studying architecture before she enlisted, and used to sketch building designs on whatever paper was available when things were slow. I am writing their names down here because they are part of this story, and because the number of ships destroyed and the number of battles won are easy to count, but the cost of each one is not a number. The cost is names. In orbit, the railgun platforms were doing what they had been built to do. The Valkyrie fleet, encountering orbital fire from hidden positions simultaneously around the planet, made a decision in the first 6 hours that their planners would later identify as a critical error. They committed a low-altitude support wing to fire suppression runs, bringing approximately 800 vessels down from strategic altitude to attempt to locate and neutralize the ground-based platforms. This brought them within optimal engagement range of exactly those platforms. Dennis Hartwell's team alone accounted for 11 ships in the first low-altitude wave. Our Lagos platform engaged targets through a rotation window managed by a targeting officer named Corporal Kate Simons, 24 years old. from Birmingham, who had been a competitive archer before the war and had, according to her personnel file, the fastest target acquisition reflex scores of anyone who had passed through our platform's training rotation. She was working a manual backup targeting interface because we had been told not to rely on automated systems during the first engagement phase. She did not miss a single acquisition in the first 4 hours. When I asked her afterward how she stayed that focused, she said, "I just kept thinking about the next one. You think about all of them at once and you lock up one at a time. 14 ships, 40 minutes, one at a time." The Valkyrie fleet, after losing over 200 vessels in the first engagement phase, pulled back to higher altitude and began orbital bombardment. They began striking city centers, communications infrastructure, transport networks. This was the moment that had broken other species. The moment when the physical evidence of destruction became too large to absorb, when the will to continue collapsed under the weight of what was being lost. They were bombing empty cities. Every structure they struck had already been emptied. Every communications tower they destroyed had a redundant buried fiber alternative already in use. Every transport route they cut had bypass routes pre-mapped and pre-distributed to every unit command. We had spent 3 months designing a planet that could absorb bombardment without losing function. What they were destroying was the surface layer. The working parts were underground, dispersed, and continuing to operate. It took them 4 days to understand that the cities were empty. 4 days in which they expended enormous energy and significant ammunition destroying structures that no longer served a military function. When their reconnaissance finally confirmed the evacuation, their commander sent a report to Dominion Command. The report stated, and this is a direct translation I read 2 years after the war when the documents were declassified, "The indigenous population appears to have anticipated our targeting doctrine. Urban centers were vacated prior to our arrival. Civilian infrastructure damage has been substantial but strategically ineffective. The population is operating from subsurface positions. We are revising engagement timelines." Revising timelines, that was the phrase they used. Their original timeline had given this war a 6-hour ceiling. They were revising it on day 4. The weeks that followed were the hardest period I experienced in the entire conflict. The ground campaign was not a series of clean victories. It was a constant grinding pressure that went in both directions. We had the advantage of terrain, preparation, and a supply chain that had been designed to function under exactly these conditions. They had the advantage of numbers, physical capability, and technology that outperformed ours in almost every direct comparison. The result was a war that neither side could end quickly. I want to describe one day in particular, roughly 3 weeks into the campaign, because I think it captures what that period felt like in a way that numbers cannot. We had been operating for 22 hours without a rest break. Our unit had moved through 3 tunnel sections, participated in 2 contact engagements, and helped clear a subsurface medical station that had been cut off from its supply chain due to a partial tunnel collapse. Our medic, a quiet man named Corporal Henry Cole, who wore a small photograph of his daughter inside his helmet visor, had worked without stopping for the last 16 of those hours. At approximately 4 in the morning, our unit stopped at White Tunnel section to eat ration packs and rest for a planned 45 minutes. We sat in a row against the tunnel wall. Nobody talked much. Someone passed around a container of water. Henry Cole fell asleep with food still in his hand before he had finished eating. And the soldier next to him, a young private named Claire Ibarra, who had never been far from her hometown in Lancashire before the war, quietly took the food from his hand, set it beside him, and then pulled her own jacket off and put it over his shoulders because the tunnel was cold. That is what the war was. Not just the railguns and the tactics and the destroyed ships. It was also Claire Ibarra in a dark tunnel at 4 in the morning, covering a sleeping man with her jacket. It was the accumulation of small decisions to keep going and keep caring about the person next to you, even when everything around you was loud and hard and exhausting. The Valkyrie had models for a lot of things. I do not believe they had a model for that. Their logistical situation began to degrade at the 6-week mark. They had provisioned for a campaign lasting days. At 6 weeks, their resupply convoys were crossing a contested approach corridor, and our asteroid belt platforms, deployed remotely from installations built during the 3-month preparation period, had begun targeting those convoys. Slowly at first. 1 interception, then 2. The Valkyrie rerouted. We adjusted the intercept positions. They rerouted again. This was not a quick victory. It was a slow and patient pressure that required continuous tracking and continuous calculation. managed by a logistics warfare team based in a deep bunker under the Swiss Alps, whose members had previously worked in supply chain management, naval mine warfare, and, in one case, competitive chess. Over the months, the Valkyrie fleet was not dramatically defeated. It was gradually starved. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the Valkyrie had not anticipated. The human war machine was still building. The orbital manufacturing installations that had been working quietly in the inner solar system during the preparation period were now producing equipment at a rate that was not possible according to the Valkyrie's assessment of our industrial capacity. Their assessment had been based on peacetime data. They had not measured what human industry could do when every person involved understood with absolute clarity exactly what failure would mean. By month 4, our first new generation mass driver platforms were operational in cislunar space. By month 7, Earth could contest low orbit in sectors around the equatorial plane. By month 9, the shape of the war had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And still the ground campaign continued. I was present for a moment about 9 months in that I have thought about more than almost any other. We had captured a Valkyrie officer. He had been injured when his command vehicle lost power in one of our EMP corridors, and by the time we reached him, he was in poor condition. Our field protocol said to stabilize and evacuate all prisoners. Henry Cole worked on him for 40 minutes. When the officer was stable and conscious, he had a translation unit that still functioned. He used it to speak to me directly. He looked at me for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "Why do you keep fighting? The Dominion does not stop. You cannot outlast the Dominion. No one has outlasted the Dominion." I gave him more water. I thought about how to answer honestly. "We are not trying to outlast you," I said. "We are trying to make this planet not worth the price of taking it. We are trying to make the number in your commander's report so large that someone at the top of your government decides that this particular planet is more trouble than it is worth and moves on." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "No species has ever made that calculation work. Nobody has tried it the way we are trying it," I said. He looked around the tunnel, at Henry Cole repacking his medical kit, at Claire Abar running a systems check on her equipment, at the 6 other members of my unit going about the business of soldiers at rest. He looked at all of this for a long time. He did not respond, but something in his expression shifted. I have thought about that shift many times since. I believe it was the moment he began to understand that what he had encountered on Earth was not a variation of what he had encountered everywhere else. It was something categorically different. Something his training and his models and his 214 previous campaigns had not prepared him to recognize. He was right that no species had made our calculation work. He was right at least about every species that had come before us. By the time the orbital kill corridor was fully operational, the Valkyrie fleet had been fighting for 14 months. That is not a long time measured against the span of their empire, which had existed for over 4,000 years. But it was longer than any prior campaign by a factor of more than 100. It was long enough that the fleet's logistical situation had moved from strained to critical. It was long enough that 3 of their original 9 fleet wings had been reduced to operational fractions of their original strength. It was long enough that their commander had sent 17 separate requests to Dominion headquarters for additional resources, and each request had been received with increasing confusion from an empire that had not modified its military doctrine in centuries, because it had never needed to. I was no longer on the ground by this point. Our unit had been reassigned to orbital operations 8 months into the campaign, one of several ground unit groups selected for cross-training on captured and repurposed Valkyrie vessels. The ship I was assigned to had been seized during a boarding operation in month 6, when a team led by a naval special operations commander named Lieutenant Owen Marsh had taken a Valkyrie cruiser in close engagement after its communication systems were disrupted. The Valkyrie had no standard defensive protocol for enemies physically inside their ships. They had not needed one before. Owen Marsh's team held the engine section for 4 hours against internal resistance, long enough for a secondary team to reach the bridge and establish control. We called the ship the Barnacle. That was Owen Marsh's name for it, and it stuck. The Valkyrie designation translated to something like honored pursuit, but nobody used that. The Barnacle was not beautiful. Our engineering teams had spent 11 weeks rewiring systems, bypassing Valkyrie control interfaces, installing manual override stations, and fitting the weapons systems with control modules that human hands could operate. Some of it worked exactly as intended. Some of it worked in ways that surprised everyone, including the engineers. A targeting array that had been designed for Valkyrie sensory input was modified to interface with a human visual display system by a technician named Rachel Park, who had previously worked repairing commercial satellite uplinks. It worked better than the original in 3 specific conditions, and worse in 2 others. We used it in the conditions where it worked better, and avoided the other 2 conditions as much as possible. The Valkyrie technicians who later reviewed our modifications described them, according to the translated records, as structurally incomprehensible, but functionally effective in ways that suggest a different conceptual approach to the same engineering problems, which is the most accurate description of about 60% of what humanity did during that war. The orbital kill corridor was the result of 14 months of coordinated effort from every branch of the defense structure. Cislunar space between the Earth and Moon had been seeded with layered minefields. Their positions changed on rotating schedules to prevent pattern mapping. The mass driver platforms operated in coordinated firing sequences designed to create overlapping coverage zones with no gap wide enough for a ship, a Valkyrie cruiser class, to transit without entering at least one engagement envelope. And behind all of that, in the space between the platforms, were the human interceptor squadrons, piloted by people who had been flying in simulation for 18 months and in live combat for the last 6 to 8 of those. When the Valkyrie fleet commander made the decision to attempt a massed breakout through the lunar corridor, the fleet wing he committed to the first push numbered approximately 4,200 ships. It was the largest single fleet action of the war. In prior Dominion history, a massed push of that scale had never failed to achieve a transit objective against an inferior technological opponent. The sheer concentration of force had always been sufficient. It was not sufficient here. What followed lasted 9 hours. I was aboard the Barnacle during the entire engagement, running a secondary weapons station under Kate Simons, who had transferred from the Lagos platform to orbital operations 4 months earlier, and had lost none of the focus I had first seen her apply to a manual targeting interface in Lagos. The engagement was not clean. Ships were lost on both sides. The noise of the Barnacle's hull under fire is something I still hear sometimes. A low vibration through the metal that felt like the ship was telling you something. Owen Marsh held the bridge through 3 direct impacts and a partial loss of forward sensor capacity, with the same steady voice he used during training exercises, which I found either very calming or very concerning depending on the moment. Of the 4,200 ships that entered the lunar corridor, fewer than 200 made it through to open space. Of those 200, our pursuit elements and the outer platform grid accounted for most of the remainder before they could reach transition distance. When the engagement ended and the count came in, I was sitting at my station, and Kate read the preliminary numbers aloud. Nobody cheered. We had been in this long enough that cheering felt wrong. The engagement had cost us ships and people who were not coming back. The victory was real, but it sat heavily, the way all real things do. What happened next was the thing I had not expected, the thing none of us had expected, even though we had been working toward it for over a year. The remaining Valkyrie fleet began to withdraw, not tactically, not pulling back to regroup. Withdrawing. The sensor arrays showed ships turning onto departure vectors, fleet groupings breaking formation and orienting away from Earth. Individual vessels, then sections, then whole wings. The commander's flagship, a vessel so large our early orbital scans had initially classified it as a small moon, began its turn in the 6th hour of the retreat. Owen Marsh's voice over the internal channel was very quiet. "Are they leaving?" Our sensor officer, a young man named Philip Cross, who had been an astronomy student before the war, checked his display 3 times before he answered. "Depart vectors are confirmed on 60% of remaining hulls and increasing. They are leaving." I looked at the viewport, at the shapes moving away from us through the dark, at the fleet that had arrived in perfect formation, that had come to absorb us as it had absorbed 214 others, that had descended on our sky with all the certainty of a species that had never been told no and had its stick. They were leaving. They were leaving because the numbers had become too large. Because the cost had exceeded whatever threshold their command had finally, after 14 months, decided was the ceiling. Because somewhere in a building I would never see, a Valkyrie administrator had looked at the reports and concluded that this particular planet was not worth the continued expenditure of resources that it would require to hold it. That was the calculation I had described to the captured officer 9 months ago. It had worked. The Council's transmission went out within the hour, broadcast on every Valkyrie frequency. It offered no celebration and no challenge. It stated, In plain terms, that any vessel remaining within 2 astronomical units of Earth after 72 hours would be treated as a continuing act of hostility. It stated that Earth was open to discussion of terms once all forces had withdrawn to minimum safe distance. It stated nothing more. I sat in my station on the barnacle for a long time after that, the hum of the ship around me, the faces of the crew, all of them as quiet as I was. Philip Cross at the sensor station, watching the departure vectors. Kate Simons with her hands folded on the targeting console, not moving. Owen Marsh standing at the center of the bridge, looking at the main display. 14 months. 2 members of my unit who were not here. Lewis and Faye. And every name like theirs multiplied across every unit on every platform and in every tunnel on every continent. The cities that were going to take years to rebuild. The families that had lived underground for over a year. All of it measured against this moment, against the shapes moving away through the dark. It did not feel like the end of something. It felt like setting down a very heavy object after carrying it for so long that you had forgotten what it was like to put it down. Not relief exactly, not triumph, something quieter and more permanent than either of those words. Owen Marsh turned from the display and looked at the crew. He did not say anything inspirational. He was not that kind of officer, he said. Good work, get some sleep when you can. We have a lot of cleanup ahead. That was enough. 3 years later, on a Tuesday morning with rain on the window and a mug of coffee going cold on my desk, I read the declassified testimony of the 17 Valkyrie who made it home. I had known for a long time that the transcripts existed. The council had held them for 2 years while the diplomatic contact process was established. The slow and careful business of beginning a conversation with an empire that had tried to absorb you and failed. When the transcripts were released, they were released without announcement or ceremony, just added to the public record archive. Philip Cross sent me a message that said simply, "They released it." I downloaded the file and sat down and read it before I did anything else that day. 17 survivors, out of 9,900 ships. The math of that is a number I will not dress up in language, it speaks for itself. The testimony was delivered in Valkyrie Senate session, and formatted as a structured debrief rather than personal narrative, so reading it required adjusting to a very different way of presenting events. But the content was clear, and certain parts of it I read more than once. The first testimony I want to describe was from a fleet sub-commander named, in their language, something our linguists transcribed as Verithsal. He commanded one of the cruiser wings that entered the lunar corridor engagement. His account of that engagement is precise and tactical, and I will not reproduce it in detail here, but his closing assessment stays with me. He said, their adaptation rate was inconsistent with the technological gap between our forces. In each phase of this engagement, they had modified their approach to account for the previous phase's outcome. By the time we identified a vulnerability, they had already identified it themselves and built a response. I do not have a tactical framework that accounts for an opponent that learns faster than the engagement cycle. The second testimony was from a ground assault commander. She had led one of the early landing parties and had survived reaching a Valkyrie lander that maintained minimal power outside the EMP corridor zones. Her account of the ground campaign is the one I found hardest to read, because she described very clearly what our people on the ground looked like from the outside, and it was stranger to see ourselves through alien eyes than I expected. She said, their loss rate was consistent with what we have observed in prior campaigns among species that were approaching the end of their resistance. But their operational effectiveness did not decline. In prior campaigns, loss creates fragmentation. Units lose cohesion. Command becomes uncertain. Among these people, loss appeared to produce the opposite result. They became more coordinated, more deliberate. I do not have a framework for this. Among the species we have encountered, grief is a force that reduces capability. Among these people, it appeared to be a force that increased it. I sat with that for a long time. She was right, I think, in a way that is hard to explain from the inside, but that makes sense when you step back. The people fought beside were not fighting because they were not afraid. They were afraid. Everyone I knew was afraid at some point during those 14 months. Lewis was afraid, and he was one of the bravest people I have known. Faye was afraid, and she never let it slow her down. What the Valkyrie had never seen before was a species that was afraid and kept going anyway, and then used the loss of the people they cared about, not as a reason to stop, but as a reason to make every subsequent action count more. That is not something you build in 90 days. That is something built over 200,000 years of being human, of surviving things that should have ended us. of losing people and continuing to exist in their absence and carrying them forward in everything we do after. We did not have better weapons, we had better reasons. The Valkyrie Senate's classified strategic verdict was the part I had been waiting for. It had been leaked before the official release, and I had seen fragments, but reading the full text was different. The formal classification assigned to Earth was Category 9 uncontested. The first time that classification had ever been applied in the history of the Dominion. The operational directive was absolute. No further incursion within 40 light-years of the Sol system was authorized. The stated reasoning was not phrased in terms of military defeat, because I believe the Valkyrie found that framing difficult to produce after 4,000 years of unbroken expansion. Instead, it was framed as resource efficiency. The cost of continued engagement with Earth exceeded projected returns from incorporation of the system. The population demonstrated sustained attrition resistance that would require ongoing military expenditure beyond acceptable parameters. The translation reads a little dry, but what it means, reduced to plain language, is this: we were too expensive to conquer and too dangerous to ignore. So they drew a line 40 light-years out and told themselves it was a resource decision. I understand the framing. If I had been on their side of this, I might have used the same framing, but we both know what it actually was. The response from the rest of the galaxy was something none of us had modeled for, and I think it may be the most significant long-term consequence of the war. The Valkyrie fleet had operated in view of monitored space for 14 months. Other species in the region had been watching. Some of them had been under Valkyrie subjugation for generations. All of them had been told, directly or by example, that resistance against the Dominion was a path to extinction, that the math simply did not work, that the sensible response to the Valkyrie was compliance. 2 years after the last ship left our system, we received a signal from a species called the Aethori. It was a small civilization, about half our population, located 60 light-years away, who had been in a partial subjugation arrangement with the Dominion for 60 years. The signal was carefully coded to avoid Valkyrie detection. It was addressed to Earth. It said, translated as closely as our linguists could manage: "We have seen what you did. We have been discussing what it means. We have questions if you are willing to speak with us." We were willing. The Aethori were the first. Within 18 months of that first contact, we had received signals from 4 other species in various stages of Valkyrie subjugation, all of them citing Earth's example, all of them asking variations of the same question: how did you make the calculation work? I was part of the team assigned to compose the response to the first 3 of those signals. It was strange work, sitting in a room trying to explain in language translatable across interstellar distances the answer to that question. We wrote many drafts. We discarded most of them. The ones we discarded were the ones that made it sound like a strategy, like a series of steps that could be copied, because it was not really a strategy. It was something harder to hand to someone else. What we eventually sent was not a manual. It was something closer to a description. We described what we had built in 90 days, and we described where those 90 days came from, the accumulated knowledge of every engineering failure, and every successful innovation, and every military defeat, and every cultural breakthrough in our entire history. We described Louis Osey and Faye Drummond and Dennis Hartwell's team in Adelaide and Oliver Rowe running drone swarm models on day 7 of his military career. We described Claire Ibarra covering Henry Cole with her jacket in a tunnel at 4 in the morning. We described what it looked like when you give an entire species the same problem and remove every other competing priority. We told them, we cannot give you what we have. It is not something that can be transferred, but we can tell you that it exists, and that the Valkyrie did not believe it existed until it was too late for that belief to matter. I finished the last document draft on a Thursday afternoon, and went home and cooked dinner and watched the rain against my kitchen window for a while. My city was still half under reconstruction. There were cranes visible from my window, always cranes now, the slow work of rebuilding happening in stages. I had gotten used to the sound of construction the way you get used to any constant background noise. It had started to feel like the city breathing. My neighbor's kid, a 7-year-old named Sam, who had been born about 8 months before the Valkyrie made contact, was outside in the narrow yard below flying a model starship on a control line. He had built it himself from a kit, and it was lopsided and that the paint job was irregular, and it flew beautifully. I watched him for a while. I thought about what the last of the 17 survivors had said at the end of his Senate testimony. He had been a mid-ranked logistics officer who survived by a sequence of accidents and timing that he described with the same flat affect as everything else in the transcript. His final statement was not strategic analysis. It was shorter than everything else he had submitted. It read, "We made an error in our assessment of the humans. We observed what they had built and made our determination based on their tools. We should have made our determination based on what they had survived. The tools were simply the evidence of the survival. We read the evidence without understanding what it meant." Sam's model starship made a wide loop above the yard and came around again. He shouted something I could not quite hear through the window. Something pleased. I pulled a blank document open on my desk. I had been thinking for a while about writing all of this down properly, not for a report or a debrief, but just as an account, an honest one. Starting from the moment the alarm went off in the barracks and the floor shook. I typed the first line. I read it back. It was the same line you read at the beginning of this. The moment I pulled on my boots before my brain had caught up with the alarm, the floor shaking, the sky not yet dark, it felt like the right place to start. Not with strategy or numbers, or the vast cold shape of 9,900 ships, with a pair of boots on a floor that was shaking, because that is how it actually began. With the ordinary moment just before the extraordinary one, with a person who had been trained and had prepared and had done their work, now finishing the last small task before the world changed. I saved the document. I gave the file a name. I called the chapter that began with that first line by the title that Owen Marsh would have used if he had been the one writing it. The title that required no further explanation to anyone who had been there, and no explanation at all to anyone who knew what we were. We were always ready.